try and get everybody to sort of shift their heads a minute and come down from the really interesting presentation of global issues, because I want to talk to you about something more mundane, but I hope something that will have some take-home value for you. As opposed to strategy and vision, I want to talk to you about a process that I've learned about over the years and I think is important. I think we all know the hardest part of change is actually making it happen, is actually doing it. So for the next 20 minutes, I want to talk to you about change and how you can make change happen in your organization and how you can take an idea and make something out of it. So for the next 20 minutes, let's just assume you are not Steve Jobs, but that you have a company that you want to change, that you want to innovate, that you want to make things happen, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my experience and how you do that. You know, we've all had great ideas, but well, first, let me start with some definitions. Let me start with the definition of a great idea versus a creative process. We've all had great ideas. They usually involve a bunch of friends, a relaxed environment, 9 times out of 10, a bunch of wine. And somebody starts talking about a fabulous place they want to go on vacation. And all of a sudden, everybody's excited about it and they want to do it. Or somebody else read this great article about a new business opportunity and they know just enough about it to be dangerous and they talk about it and all of a sudden everybody decides that they really want to do something about it. And everybody before they leave that night, Fred commits he's going to call the travel agent and he's going to book a vacation for everybody. Mary commits that she's going to talk to her banker or an investor friend and they're going to put a deal together and everybody's going to invest. Well, we've all had that experience. We've also had the experience of then getting up the next morning and going to work and completely forgetting about the entire thing. That's what you've just had is a good time with friends, and you may have had a great idea, but you have not been part of a creative process. So what does it take to capture this idea, to harness this energy that was obviously evident, and turn it into something that you can hear, play, see, feel, do something with? This is not my definition, but it's a good one. Creativity has been called having an original idea that has value. And I like that. It doesn't necessarily mean commercial value, but it means value of some kind that you can do something with. So what I want to do is take you through a process, at least the process that I've been part of managing, to see if we can see how a creative process breaks down and how you can use it in your own business. I don't want to minimize the idea process that I just talked about, because that's where everything starts. One of the first things you have to be able to do as a manager of that process is to anticipate that a great idea can come from anywhere. My favorite example of that was a Disney example of we had a group of 15 people brainstorming. We realized we needed another water park at Walt Disney World. The one we had was too crowded. But we didn't want to do another Robinson Crusoe or Deserted Island sort of theme, so we had all these Imagineers together to try and decide what to do. What could we do that would be creative and fun and different? We'd been together for hours and we were just drawing a blank. One of the guys went to the bathroom and as he was coming back, he walked by a cubicle of a guy who, for some reason I've never understood, had a collection of snow globes. About 25 tacky snow globes. And he went and picked one of them up and walked back in the room and looked at the rest of the group and said, "What if a freak snowstorm came through Central Florida?" That was the birth of Blizzard Beach, which is the second water park at Walt Disney World. The other thing you need to think about when you think about that is that coming up with something like that, it took nerve to walk in the room with that snow globe and say, "What about a snowstorm in Central Florida?" There was a significant risk that he would have been thrown out of the room or booed out of the room or made fun of. You can't be afraid to be wrong. You've got to have the courage of your convictions. You've got to have the willingness to say, I think this is a good idea. Sometimes a spark of an idea can come from any place, and you've got to be smart enough to be able to recognize it. I can tell you from my personal experience that the bolt of lightning, the snow globe, is a rarity. More typically, something starts in one form, the notion gets tugged at, it gets pulled, it gets bent, it gets repainted, it gets redefined, and it ends up in some altered state that actually becomes what then becomes known as the idea. So the challenge in running a creative process is the exercise in creating a climate that encourages that free flow of back and forth ideas, but it's also a constant struggle in establishing the space that allows that free flow to happen. There's another caveat I think that is important here. What I'm talking about is creativity in a creative process. What I am not talking about is how Robert Frost came up with Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, or how John Mayer writes the lyrics to his music. The creative process I'm talking about is what it takes to create a physical product or something that has to operate, which is what all the people in this room do. I'm not talking about creative writing or the self-expression process. There's been a lot written about that recently, including a really smart book called Imagine by a guy named Jonathan Lehrer that is interesting. He spends a lot of time talking about how you position yourself for that creative spark. I know just enough about that to know that it's a very different process, and I frankly think that to some degree you're either John Mayer or you're not. And you just need to put up with that. What I'm talking about is the process that we do to run our businesses, to improve our businesses, to create a new idea. So to maintain the environment that creates that creativity, I think there are at least three things that you need to think about. First, as I mentioned, you need an environment that says, I'm not going to laugh at you. I'll laugh with you, but I'm not going to laugh at you. And I'm going to listen. An environment where smart people are comfortable kicking things around. And by smart, I don't necessarily mean the people you know with the highest IQs. Big egos and those people that won't listen are worthless in this kind of a process. You need people who are inquisitive, people who are observant, and people who, more than anything else, are willing to listen to somebody else, absorb what they say, process it, and then do something with it. It's got to be an environment that invites risk-taking, and it allows failure, even big failures. The creative process, by definition, is an inventing process, and it's, as somebody said this morning, it's impossible that all ideas are going to succeed. There was a great quote this morning about failure and big failures, and that's the kind of thing you've got to have. At Imagineering, we had an idea fair every year, which I didn't understand in the beginning, but I got to be a huge fan of. We looked at projects that were in the archives that had not been approved or had failed for some reason, and we brought them back. We learned I think it proved two really important things. Number one, some of those projects that didn't get approved were done by some of the smartest teams of Imagineers there were. So that reinforced the fact that smart people and good people and talented people can fail. The other thing it did was you found when you brought ideas back that had been put on the shelf 2 or 3 years ago, lots of times things fail not because it wasn't a good idea, they fail because the time wasn't right. They fail because the politics weren't right. They fail because the circumstances weren't right. So, excuse me, the net result of that is it makes you paranoid to ever throw anything away. And we were pack rats, and Disney was famous for it. Everything we did, whether it was approved or not, got tied up and bundled up and put on a shelf so that we could look at it again. So if you're going to be in the idea process, you need a self-storage building. The second thing you have to learn is, in order to make this process work, there's got to be an enormous diversity of ideas. People sometimes say that guy had the creativity of an accountant. Well, you know, accountants have a valuable place in this process, but you can't leave a bunch of accountants by themselves. You've got to put a storyteller with them and a marketing person and a graphics person and somebody else so that you can round out the crowd. The accountant is going to have valuable input, but only if that is balanced by the other things that the group brings you. The third thing that you need is, which is complicated, is what I've called protection during the incubation process. One of the most frustrating things for people who don't understand the creative process is to be told, we don't know when we'll be ready. As one of my senior Disney people used to say, you can't schedule inspiration. All you can do is have an inspirational schedule. And I think that's right. If you try to force a decision, if you try to make something meet an arbitrary timeline, there's an enormous risk of failure. I've seen good ideas killed that way. We all have. It happens because somebody was able to interrupt the process and say to the group, okay, show me what you've got, before they're really ready. You know, business is about schedules, and I understand that. But the creative process doesn't lend itself to schedules. And if you don't bake that into your thinking when you start the process, you're destined for a problem. If things go right, you could be done early. But it's equally possible that you won't be. If you can develop a culture that within some reasonable limits understands that ideas obey their own time frame, then your chances of success are much, much greater. Let me stop here and make an observation that I think is important. I've talked about this over the years a lot, but this is the first time I've had this conversation with a group since the death of Steve Jobs. In the creative world today, it is impossible to have a conversation about creativity without Jobs' name coming up. He's such a force in that area that everybody's first question is, how do your theories mesh with the way Steve Jobs did business? Well, I only knew him slightly. I met him through Michael Eisner. He came to us for some real estate advice, and so I spent a little bit of time with him. I have two observations. One is he was a great listener. He just asked endless questions. But I can tell you that he then took the answers and went off and did whatever he wanted to do, which, if you read Walter Isaacson's book, is exactly apparently his modus operandi. But I think it's important to understand that I think this worship and this celebration of Jobs, I think, comes at a price, with all due respect to him. The truth is that most of us, you know, I'll bet there aren't more than 40 or 50 Steve Jobs in this room. It's just not, it's not the way most people are wired. He was a unique, careful person. So unless you can close your eyes and see iPad, then this process, which is the process I'm talking about, is the one that most of us are destined, I think, first to deal with. The next step in that process is sort of the opposite of what I was just talking about. There's a creative flow that goes on. The challenge is, when do you stop that process? That is one of the critical decisions in any creative process. Art has been defined as getting something where you like it and leaving it that way. So whatever the dynamics are, there does have to be a point at which somebody says stop. You then have to move to the next major point in the creative process. The first point was coming up with the idea in the first place. The second one is the point where you try and convert the idea into a set of action steps. Typically, there'll be a point where there has to be some summing up, and then there's some assignments to do. Okay, you do this, you do that, so that the idea can be broken down into component parts and people can work on it. This assignment phase is incredibly risky. If the assignments aren't made carefully, if the idea is not really an idea yet, if you've yelled stop too soon, then the assignments will be unexecutable. They'll contradict each other, or it'll just be too vague to make the next step worthwhile. As soon as you start the transition from the pure idea stage to this process stage, the environment also has to change. For all the freedom and loosey-goosey of that first phrase, the freewheeling, no holds barred, everybody talks sort of environment, it's important now that you start to introduce boundaries and fences and constraints. When you start assigning tasks to individuals, you inevitably will get questions back about schedule, budget, and deliverables. And the nature of your answer is going to start defining parameters and constraints that are a part of this process and a healthy part of this process if they're introduced at the right time. Do I have 60 days to do this or 6 months? Do I have $1 million budget or a $10 million budget? As soon as you tell somebody they only have $1 million to do something, you have taken an ocean of alternatives off the table. But if you're at the right place in the process, then doing that makes your process more efficient and allows you to move on to the next stage. As the process matures, you've got to have these boundaries or you'll never get beyond the idea stage. It's also important during this stage to keep what I call a reference point, a guideline, something that you can keep going back to. As the team starts taking its different assignments and going off in different directions, there's got to be a true north of some kind that is your guidepost, that is your raison d'etre, that is the single sentence that defines your idea that you can keep coming back to. I found that great ideas can get whittled, diluted, changed, not through bad intentions, but through the inevitable incremental changes that occur during this stage. And so if you don't have a way of going back to it, you're going to stray. I'll give you an example from Philippe's and my history at Disney. It's a project called Disneyland, or Euro Disney, now Disneyland Paris. The original idea for Disneyland Paris was to take the Disney theme park, the Magic Kingdom, and plop it in the middle of what was then the wealthiest population concentration in the world. There were 350 million people who lived an hour or 2 hour drive from Paris. That was the idea, Disney theme park in the middle of enormous population. The concept was right. Unfortunately, as we entered the execution stage, we got confused and all caught up in a whole bunch of other stuff. And we started to build a mega resort with a huge number of hotel rooms as opposed to staying focused on the theme park using its population. So we overbuilt the hotel because we got all caught up in the vision of it and because we thought we were smarter than everybody else and lost the integrity of the original idea. Fortunately, because it was Disney and they had financial staying power, we were able to endure, and the place is a success today because we had that ability. But we lost the reason why we went there, and it was an expensive mistake. There's another major point that I think is common in most of the processes I've seen. I would define it as somewhere between the top of the second and the bottom of the third inning, or 15 minutes into the game if you play soccer. It's when all the teams have come together, the idea's begun to gel, there's a real sense of progress, you can finally see that things are coming together. Enough of the original idea is still intact, that the integrity of the concept is there, and then boom, out of left field comes something. The lawyers say they can't patent it. The engineers say that there's no way to make it work. Your construction manager says it's 20% over budget. Whatever it is, you never never exactly sure where it's going to come from, which is why it's called a surprise, but there is going to be one, and it's inevitable. The secret, obviously, is not to panic. This is one of those times when some gray hair and when having been through the process 40 or 50 times is really valuable, because the first thing you've got to do is pull everybody back together, look at where you are, check the assumptions, understand what those early assignments were and how they were executed. It's almost an autopsy of the process to date to understand where you are. It takes communication like you've never communicated in your life and listening to everybody's point of view, but there's usually a way through it, but expect it. You can't budget it, you can't plan for it because you don't know how long it's going to take to correct it, but just know it's out there. Finally, I think there's one last thing that's fundamental to this process. companies, even creative companies, are deadly serious places about making money and shareholder value and stock price and bank loans and all those other things. But my own experience in the creative process is that it completely breaks down without a sense of humor. If you don't have the ability to laugh at yourself, if you don't have the ability to laugh at other people, if they don't have the ability to be laughed at, then if you get so caught up with yourselves that you think you can't be laughed at, then you're not a valuable part of that process. And it sounds silly and it sounds trite, but I've seen things destroyed by people who just get so caught up in what they're doing that they forget that there's got to be this large dose of humility and the sense of humor that goes along with that. Finally, there's one last point that I think is important, and you can tell this is sort of my Disney mentality, but I think it's important for any business. It doesn't have to be Disney to think about that. And I think it's important for anybody who's running a business and particularly somebody who's growing a business, who's looking at things that might be new as a way to add a leg to the business or add something else to it. I would generally put it under the category of, does it fit the franchise? Any company has to decide what its strengths and its weaknesses are and what its franchise should be. And how do these new ideas, now hopefully properly baked, strategically fit into that franchise and reinforce the franchise? Or if you decide that something that you're going to do is a big enough idea and worthy enough that you're going to step outside that franchise, then do it consciously, very consciously, and make sure that you've examined all the possibilities of that. There are all kinds of business opportunities around. There are all kinds of ways to make money, but if it doesn't reinforce what you're doing, then adding it to what you're doing is an enormous risk. So that's a walk through a process. It's a complicated process, but I think if you don't think about it as having steps of some kind, then to a lot of people, I've found that it becomes a blur. It becomes a challenge that they're afraid to start because they think if they're not Steve Jobs, they can't ever do something like that, and that's just not true. There are people who are more creative than other people, but there are lots of ways that you can aid your process by thinking about what you're doing and by being careful about how you move from one step to another. I got married late in life, and so I have young children for somebody my age, and people accuse me all the time of comparing everything to child rearing, and maybe it's just because it's on my mind a lot. But in my mind, child rearing is the ultimate creative process. It's incredibly rewarding, sometimes very scary, sometimes unpredictable, but in the end, a hell of a lot of fun. Thank you very much.